if you practiced, you'd be great at it. Like, I didn't start practicing until I was 25, 24, whatever, something like that. Anyway, what do you think about it? How's it going, everybody? Everybody been enjoying the weather? I know I have. That said, I did hear that we're going to have like the most miserable winter in the history of ever. That's what the weatherman said. And so I am a little nervous that cool weather now means really cool weather in about 2 months. And that all of us are going to be in here and we're going to be complaining and shivering and we're going to be miserable. And we're going to remember why it is that we chose Arkansas of all the states to live in, because it's hot and humid and we like that. I think it's warming up a little this next week, and so hopefully that'll be true. I'm sorry, I'm going to put these down. If I keep things in my pocket, you know what's going to happen. I'm just going to play with it the entire time I'm talking. Guys, we're so glad to have you here. It's so good to have our visitors. Thank you so much for coming, and for all y'all regulars, we're glad to have you as well. I just want to remind you that the last couple of weeks we've been talking about Genesis, and we've gotten to a part of Genesis where the story changes a little bit. We've gotten to a part in Genesis where we're going to move from one focus, we're going to start moving to another. You remember several weeks ago when we started talking about Genesis, we talked about the key verse of Genesis. The verse of Genesis that tells us what Genesis is all about. And that was in chapter 12 in verse 1. And that's the blessing of Abraham. Where God sits Abraham down and says, look, Abraham, leave your family. Go to this new place I'm going to show you. And he gives him some important blessings. But the one that he gives him that tells us what it's about, he says, I'll bless those who bless you. I'll curse those who curse you. And all of the nations of the earth will be blessed through you. That through Abraham, blessing is going to come to everybody. And because we understand now the arc of the Old Testament and how that story went, we understand that became the descendants of Abraham, that Abraham's children became multiple. And that they even became an empire under David. And under Solomon, that empire was solidified. But then that empire went away, and what was left was a remnant. And that remnant was blessed, and that remnant was blessed, and that remnant was kept, and that remnant was kept. And eventually, that leads right to Zerubbabel. We talked about him. And then eventually, even all the way, straight to Jesus. And then when God tells Abraham, all of the nations of the earth will be blessed through you, ultimately what he's telling us is that Jesus is going to come through the line of Abraham. But that's the key verse in Genesis. It's where Genesis stops being about one thing and it starts being about something else. And so what has it been about? Well, so far, Genesis has been about the creation of all things, right? That God created the earth and he created it not only good, but good. Not only good, but very good. Exceedingly good. Nice. Perfect even. That when man looked in a mirror, he would say, I'm good. This is nice. This is how God created me, and it's a blessing that he could be unashamed in front of God. And that's how he created it. And then we start to see the rejection of that plan. And that's the story we've been walking down, right? We've been walking down the story of God created everything good, and then Adam and Eve said, we don't need this. We don't want this. We want something else. And so Adam and Eve did what they did in the garden. And then we see that rejection come more fully with Cain and Abel. Where Cain purposed in his heart to reject the plan of God, and it said that sin wanted to get him, and it did. And that Cain committed murder of his brother. And then last week we talked about Genesis chapter 5 and the genealogy, and where it ends at that. And at Genesis 6:5, God gives his summary of what's gone on so far. Genesis 6, chapter 6, verse 5, here's what it says. Then the Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great on the earth, and that every intent of his thoughts, of the thought of his heart, was only evil continuously. Verse 6, the Lord was sorry that he had made man on earth, and he was grieved in his heart. So the story we've been walking down so far is the story of God creating everything just like it was supposed to be. And humans, step by step, stepping back from that plan. We've gone 10 generations now from Adam, right? From Adam to Noah. We talked about that last week. We've gone 10 generations. And in those 10 generations, we've gotten worse and worse and worse. And it's no different than humanity now. See, what we permit ourselves to do, our kids will do all the way in excess, right? And we can think about this in the conversation of divorce. For those of you who've been alive long enough that have functional memories of the 60s, okay? Some of you, you don't have to raise your hand. But some of you have been there. You have functional memories of the 60s. those of you who remember that in the 60s, if somebody got a divorce, that was taboo. That was bad. That was a no-no. They were looked down upon. People said, you shouldn't do that. That you should stay together. That you should work it out. That in the 60s, that was the way we thought about divorce. A couple of weeks ago, I read an article about a celebrity who they were having a divorce, and they said it's not a divorce. They called it a conscientious uncoupling. They said, this divorce is the right thing to do for my family and for me and for even the husband. That it's good for us to have a divorce. And I told you about the article I read a couple of weeks ago, like 2 weeks ago, that said divorce was good for marriage. How is that even a thought in somebody's brain? That in the 60s, people permitted themselves to have a divorce, and by the 80s, divorce became normal, and now divorce is just the way it works, right? You get married, and there's probably a 50-50 chance that you won't be married at the end of your life. That's what's going on with this generation of Noah. The sons, Adam had sinned. His sons pushed it further. His sons pushed it further. His sons pushed it further. And it gets to this verse 6 of chapter 6. The Lord was sorry that he made man on earth. And he was greatly grieved in his heart. He was grieved in his heart. His heart was sad that he had created humanity at all. Just 5 chapters ago, just about 1,000 years before this, we get the story in Eden where God says, it's all good. And it's gone from it's all good to God says, I'm sorry I made it. It's sad. It's sorry. It's not a good state of affairs. And God is so grieved in his heart that he decides that he's going to change the way that he interacts with humanity. You see, up to this point, God had interacted with all of humanity. He said, here's the deal. Here's what I want you to live in this way. Go forth and multiply on the earth. Do these things, right? Offer sacrifices. We know that they were doing that. We know that they had to worship God. We knew that. That there weren't many rules. It was basically be a good person. That was the rule. And they failed at it. They fell short of be a good person. They fell short of don't have babies with angels. They fell short of just be a normal human being. They couldn't keep that standard. So God said, okay, I can see where this is going. It's bad, and it's only getting worse. And he says, I'm going to do a new thing. And by the time we get to chapter 12, we see what that is. He says, I'm going to take all the people of the earth, I'm going to pick one, and I'm going to bless him specially. That's what we get with Abraham. And we'll talk a lot about that when we get to Abraham. He says, of all the people in the world, I'm going to pick one, and I'm going to give him everything that he could ever want. Every blessing. He's going to have money. He's going to have family. He's going to have people around him who care about him. He's going to have a happy, long life. And it's going to be good to be Abraham. And I'm going to bless him, and I'm going to bless his kids, and I'm going to bless his kids' kids, and we'll see how that works. And so he's going to change his way of focusing from all of earth to just one family. But there are 2 stories between here and there. There are 2 stories that we need to understand between here and there. And the first one is Noah, and we're going to talk about that today. And the second one is the Tower of Babel, and we'll talk about that next week. And these 2 stories transition us. They get us from everything getting worse and worse and worse and worse and worse to God saying, we're going to do a new thing. We're going to go a different route. We're going to try something different. And I'm going to pray, and then we're going to get into the story of Noah. Here we go. God, thank you for bringing us here today and giving us a chance to talk about the story of Noah. God, I do pray that as we get into Noah today, that you would just bless us with understanding. That this is a long story with a lot of details. And God, I pray that you would help me to bring the right details forward. God, I pray that you would move in me, that your Holy Spirit would move through me to give us a good focus and a good understanding of what's going on. God, I pray that as we talk about the Bible today, that your heart for humanity would be seen. That your heart for righteousness would be revealed. And God, that because we're here today, we will learn to live just a little more like Christ. That because of what we learned today, we would do just a little better in our daily walk. That we would walk just a little closer with you. And be one step closer to the one day we can stand before you and you'll tell us, well done, my good and faithful servant. You've run your race well. God, I pray that today would advance that. We pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen. So guys, the story of Noah is long. It's long, long. So far we've been talking about stories that mostly happen in one chapter. The story of Noah spans 3 whole chapters and parts of 2 others. And while I would love to sit here and read to you the entire 4 or 5 chapter section that it is, I think that would be counterproductive, and also we would run out of time. And so I'm going to summarize for you, but I would encourage you to take notes, listen, and go back and check me and make sure that I summarize it correctly. Here's what we start with. The story of Noah goes like this. In 6:8, we learned that Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. In 6:10, we learned that Noah had 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And then God tells Noah to make a big boat. God said, make a big boat. Make it out of gopher wood, seal it this way, put windows in it. He gives them very detailed instructions to make a really big boat. And when I say big boat, the size of a football field and 3 stories tall. That's how big this boat is. This is not a rinky-dink kind of thing. My kids have a toy, a Noah's Ark toy, and it's cool. It's got little animals, 2x2. Most of the animals, let's be honest, are 1x1 now because they're kids and they lose them. But when it came, it had 2x2, all the animals. And the animals would get on the ark and they could all fit. There's a giraffe and an elephant. I think there was one for every letter of the alphabet, actually, if I remember this toy correctly. There was an A and a B and a C, so on and so on. So there are 26 animals. And if you crammed them, you could get all 26 into that little boat. But that's only 26 animals. And how many animals are there? Right? Thousands. And so our scale on Noah's Ark is wrong, because when we go into kids' nurseries, we see these fun pictures with giraffes and their heads hanging out and elephants walking around on top. And those are great pictures. They're great fun. But understand that that's not drawn to scale. Noah's Ark is as big as a football field and 3 stories tall. It was really, really big. Fitting the animals in wouldn't have been the issue on Noah's Ark. Okay? So when you see those pictures, enjoy them, like them, but don't let it into your head that it was small, because then the story of Noah's Ark becomes a cartoon to you. And it's not a cartoon, it's a real story. God tells Noah to make a big boat, and then God plans in his head. It says God said to himself, I plan to destroy all the flesh. That's in 6 verse 18. He said it to himself. He decided internally, which I think is interesting that God lets us into that. And then Noah is to save a representative from all the species. That's save the animals 2x2. Then the rains came down. And chapter 7 is all about that. It tells us there are 40 days of rain and 150 days of flooding. That it rained continuously for 40 days, and there were 150 days of flooding. Now, if you live in Odin and you've lived here for more than a year, you know that 19 inches of rain is what it takes to completely flood most of this, right? We learned that the week after I moved here, right? We had 3 days of rain, about 19 inches, and everything was underwater. You all remember that? Right? I'm not making it up. That happened. That was 3 days of rain. And this is 40 days of rain. 40 days continuously just raining. And I don't imagine this is like Seattle rain, where it's just a little mist. I think this is 40 days of raining like we get here in the South. Pouring rain. Night and day, nonstop, 40 days. Some people have made some hay about whether or not the rain could completely cover the earth, and they're wrong. Because we know now, because we've mapped the earth, that we could sink all of the land we have into the oceans we have. If we cut off all the land, we could sink it all in. There is enough water on earth to cover the whole earth if the mountains were just a little less mountainy. And that's entirely possible in the days of Noah. We don't know what the earth looked like back then, but there is enough water. Don't get yourself tripped up on that. 40 days of rain, 150 days of flooding, and then in verse 8:13, the water recedes. In verse 8:20, Adam builds an altar. God tells himself, God says to himself, I will never again destroy all living things. God makes a covenant. That's chapter 9, verses 1 through 17. And the covenant goes like this. Man can now eat meat. He said, just like you've been eating the plants, now you can also eat meat. Man cannot eat living meat. So you cannot go and take a bite out of a cow fresh in the field. That is against the rules. You may not eat meat that's living. I don't believe that applies to sushi. That is dead, just raw. It's talking about you can't take something that's alive and just take bites out of it, okay? It's bad. And there's a good reason for that. That'll kill you. That'll make you sick, okay? So man cannot eat living meat. People are to populate the earth. He tells Noah at this point to go forth and populate the earth. He says God will not flood the earth. It says people aren't to kill each other, actually. He says that first. He says, at this point, he said, look, man is created in my image, and for that reason, you can't kill each other. And that if you do kill each other, the person who killed somebody, you got to kill that person. And that was the deal he made. Essentially the death penalty, because they didn't have jails back then, right? And then God says he won't flood the earth again, and he gives us a sign of his covenant, which is the rainbow. And that's the very first covenant that we see God making with man. He gave us a list of rules to follow. So follow these rules. eat meat, don't eat raw meat, don't kill people, I won't flood the earth again, here's a rainbow, sign of the covenant, go forth and have lots of babies. God gives us a covenant. He gives it to Noah, and he said, that's the rule that you're going to go to. And at this point, Noah's story travels in a really straight line. I wish I could stop here in Noah's story. When I think about the story of Noah, it disturbs me because up to this point, Noah's story had gone just like I would expect it to go. Noah was a righteous man. God saw that he was righteous when everybody else wasn't, and he blessed him. He said, I'm going to give you special knowledge. There's a flood coming. Build a boat. Save humanity. Save the animals. And the reason I've chosen you is because you're a good guy. But then Noah's story takes a 90-degree turn. We get one more story. Moses gives us one more story about Noah. Not entirely sure why he does it, except that it's just kind of what Moses does. He gives us the dirt. And there's one more story about Noah, and it goes like this. When Noah got off the boat, he planted a vineyard. And when he planted the vineyard, he put grapes in it. And when the grapes were mature, he made wine out of them. No problem. When the wine was ready, Noah drank the wine. All of it. He got real drunk. He got so drunk that he went back to his tent and he passed out. And then it says his son came in. His son came in, and it said his son looked upon his nakedness. And then it says his other son, his son was proud of the fact that he looked upon his nakedness, and his son left the tent. He told his other brothers about it, and his other brothers came in and covered his nakedness, and then that's the end of the story. They put a cloak on him, and then the story goes that Noah woke up, he knew what had happened, and he cursed the son. He said, you're going to be a servant amongst your brothers. You're going to be a servant amongst your brothers, your kids will serve their kids, and so on and so on. And then, that's the end of Noah's story. It cuts off. Then we get the Tower of Babel. Here's the kids that they had, and then the Tower of Babel. It's a weird ending, and I don't understand it. I don't. For a couple of reasons. One is that what happened in the tent is not exactly clear. It said that the son looked upon his nakedness, which in itself might be a bad enough sin back then. You see, that would have been dignity stealing. Now, I've seen my father naked. I'm not, too ashamed to admit that. I lived in a house with him, and at some point I saw him naked. But back then, seeing it's this intentional going in to see him naked, to mock him and his drunkenness. That might have been the problem. That might have been the sin that they're talking about. But I don't think so. Moses tend to euphemize. He tend to make metaphors. And when it says that he gazed upon his nakedness, those of you who are old enough to connect the dots there might be able to figure out what happened. I don't want to say it explicitly because there are children here, but it was probably naughty. It was probably something very bad. There are a lot of explanations. That explanation makes the most sense to me as to why Moses was so mad about what happened. Is that it wasn't just that he saw him naked. And it wasn't just that he picked on him for seeing him naked. Or that he didn't preserve his dignity. But it's a weird story because why was Noah drunk in the first place? We don't get the impression from Noah, from any other stories of the Bible, that he was drunk a lot. People talk about Noah having been an alcoholic. I don't know that he is. This is the only story we have of Noah being drunk, and he was real drunk. But up to this point, we don't see Noah just sitting around drinking a lot. In fact, God tells us that he was righteous in his generation. I've got to think that there's something going on in Noah's head. Because when we think about the ark story, we always think about it from Noah's perspective and God's perspective, but we don't think about what Noah actually saw. Think about the time that Noah lived in. Everybody that Noah knew, save the family members that he saved, died. Most of them in a flood. While the waters are rising, God had closed the door. Do you think his neighbors came over and said, let us in? Do you think his neighbors knocked on the door? Do you think Noah had to live with that story? Live with that reality? That everything that had been created, except for the 8 people that were in that boat, drowned, had died in a pretty awful way. I mean, it would have been relatively quick. It wouldn't have lasted much more than, however long they could swim, which who knows how long that is. But I gotta think that was awful for Noah. And his response might have been to descend into drinking. We've seen that with people, right? That's a normal response. But it's a weird story for Noah, because I want to think of Noah as this hero of the faith. I want to think of Noah as this guy who was super righteous, who did things right, and who God blessed, and he turned around and said, good. But Noah's more human than that. Noah's more real than that. Moses has this, I want to say, anointing way of capturing that aspect of humanity. Because we see it about everybody, right? Abraham was a really good guy until he tried to sell his wife into slavery. Right? Right? Then we see this in most of the stories that we have in the Old Testament. We see these guys were really awesome people until they did this really dumb thing. And it wasn't just Moses, because we get that about David and Solomon. We get that about all the prophets. We get that about all the disciples. There's something about God that He wants us to know, that the heroes of the faith aren't heroes of the faith because they don't mess up. They're not heroes of the faith because bad things don't happen to them. They're heroes of the faith because they have faith. Because they turn to God. And we don't get any of Noah's story after this, and I don't know what happened, and neither does anybody else. But we know that Noah's story is a difficult one because of that story. It's easy if you take that out. If we take that out, then Noah is hands down the hero of the Bible, a type of Christ, a guy who came and saved humanity. Noah is an awesome guy, and he still is. He's just an awesome, real guy, right? That story makes it hard for me to tell. I worked and worked as I was writing the sermon on where to put that story and what to do with it. And there's nothing really to do with it except leave it there. You should know that Noah was a good guy, a righteous guy. Bad things happened to him, and he made mistakes. And more bad things happened to him. But God, fortunately, gives us the summary of Noah's life. Noah was one of those guys whose epitaph was written by God. The God later on in the Bible tells us, hey, you remember that guy Noah? Here's what you should think about him. And if you'll turn your Bibles to Hebrews chapter 11, verse 7, we'll look at what God says about Noah. And hopefully get some perspective and some things to take home. Hebrews chapter 11, verse 7. So in Hebrews chapter 11, we get God's perspective on Noah's life. We get what God saw when He looked at Noah. This section of the Bible is commonly referred to as the Hall of Faith. Some people call it like a Hall of Fame for the people who have faith. And it talks about over and over again, this guy did this by faith. And it talks about Abraham, and it talks about Moses. And here it talks about Noah. And it gives us God's perspective on Noah's life. Here's what it says. By faith, Noah, being warned by God about things not yet seen, in reverence prepared an ark for the salvation of his household, by which he condemned the world, and became an heir of the righteousness which is according to faith. It says, by faith Noah, being warned by God about things not yet seen, in reverence prepared an ark for the salvation of his household, by which he condemned the world, and became an heir of the righteousness which is according to faith. He became an heir of righteousness, which is according to faith. When we say that Noah is righteous, it says he's an heir of righteousness, but that righteousness comes by faith. That righteousness comes through faith. Noah's not righteous because he didn't mess up. He's righteous because he had faith in a God who had the ability to make him righteous. He had faith in a God who, when he sinned against that God said, I don't count that. That's not on you. See, Hebrews 11 tells us that what we should learn from Noah's story is that your faith matters. And further than your faith, your actions matter. It said that Noah's actions were important. By faith, he built an ark. His faith was demonstrated by building the ark. If Noah hadn't built the ark, would he have had faith? If God comes to you and says, look, here's what's going to happen. It's going to start raining in Odin a lot. And I promised not to flood the whole earth, but I didn't promise not to flood the whole Odin. And so what you need to do is get a little boat. And you say, God, that's cool. I believe in you, but I'm not going to get a boat because it's not going to flood Odin, because that doesn't happen. right? If I said that to God, would I have faith? No, right? Because God told Noah, he said, it's going to flood. Every bad stuff's going to happen. You need to build a boat. Not just a boat, a really big boat. And this boat's going to take you a long, long time to build. And while you're building it, there's not going to be any sign that bad things are going to happen. You get them, Emmer. There's not going to be any sign that bad things are going to happen. You're just going to be sitting out there in a field, building a boat, do it. And Noah says, okay, I believe you, God. I have faith. His boat building demonstrated his faith. It didn't give him faith. It showed everybody that he had faith. It showed himself that he had faith. His faith mattered. And when you study the story of Noah, one of the things you should know, what God takes from that story is that Noah is a man of faith. That when God looked over the earth, he said, that Noah, I'm going to tell him because he has faith. Ezekiel 14:12-14, it says this about Noah. Then the word of the Lord came to me, saying, Son of man, if a country sins against me by committing unfaithfulness, and I stretch out my hand against it, destroy its supply of bread, and send famine against it, and cut off from it both man and beast, even though these three men, Noah, Daniel, and Job, were in its midst, by their own righteousness they could only deliver themselves, declares the Lord of God. It's a little bit confusing because it's prophecy, but understand what he's saying. He said, look, if there's a country, and that country is terrible, 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 and I decide I'm going to cut off that country, I'm going to unbless that country, I'm going to remove my hand of favor from that country, even if that happens, and if that happens, and there's the man in the midst, Noah, Job, Daniel, their righteousness can't save the whole country. It can only save themselves. And in this verse, it tells us about Noah, that Noah gives us an example to use if we're living in a country that's rejected God. He puts it with two other people, right? Daniel and Job. And Daniel and Job both lived in times of great unrighteousness, along with Noah. All three of these guys lived in a time when everybody around them had rejected God. When everybody around them had said, you know what, God? We don't need you. We don't like you. We don't want you. Go away. All three of those men lived in that time. It said that during Noah's time, that God was grieved that he even created humanity in the first place. Daniel lived in a time when God was so grieved about the blessing of Israel that he removed Israel from their country and put them in another country. Job lived in a time when people mocked him for his righteousness. When even his friends told him, curse God and die. That's the time that Job lived in. These aren't people who lived in times when there was a lot of support for their faith. We talked about last week the parallel of the time that Noah was living in and the time that we're living in. And I don't want to rehash that. But what I want to say is Noah is the example for that. Noah's example for us, I love this. Be weird. Be weird. Don't be normal. Normal in America is divorced. Normal in America is I go to church on Christmas and Easter. Maybe. Normal in America is I trust in my own ability to make money. Normal in America is not righteous. Normal in America is not trusting in God. Noah lived in a time similar to that. And what did he do? He got super weird. He was righteous when other people weren't. Daniel said, they brought before Daniel, right, all that food, all that good food. They said, eat this food, get strong. And Daniel said, give me bread. Give me vegetables, always want vegetables. And God blessed him. Because he fit in? Because he was normal? No, because he was weird. God's call on you is don't fit in. Don't fit in. If you fit in to the times we live in now, if you fit into the times we lived in the 50s, you weren't righteous. Because we weren't righteous as the people in the 50s. We aren't righteous as the people now. We weren't righteous as the people in the 1900s. There were never the good old days. Those days never existed. Humanity pushes away from God in every chance. That's what these stories tell us. Humanity is always stepping away from God. And what does God do? He protects a remnant. Be the remnant. Be the few. Be the weird. The way to heaven is small. It's narrow. It's hard. It's tiny. You have to work on it. You can't just walk whatever willy-nilly way you want and expect to be on the path of God. You can't just do whatever comes to your head and expect that God will just bless whatever I do, because that's not the way God works. He says, be in His will. Noah got out of his comfort zone. He got out of normal. He got out of the normal track that everybody was on. And because of it, God saved humanity. God allowed him to build a boat to save humanity going into the future. That's the call. If you're living in America now and you look around and you say, everybody's doing it, well, you can probably bet that it's not a good idea for you to do. Now, I'm not telling you to throw out your TV. I'm not telling you to boycott every company. I'm not telling you that you should become Amish, right, and live in a little carriage and have a buggy. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is examine your actions. Make decisions. Look at the way you live. Live in a way that's righteous, even if that righteous way is hard. Even if everybody's putting down on their time card that they left a few minutes after they actually did, just stealing a few minutes here and there. Even if everybody's doing that, you don't do it. Even if everybody's fudging up their numbers for the IRS and turning in a slightly unrighteous tax report, you don't do it. Be weird. Pay all your taxes. Don't steal. Be a good person. Do good. Care about people who don't have stuff. Be weird. That's the call. That's Noah. And that's what God tells us to think about Noah, but one more. In Matthew, God tells us, but on that day, in that hour, no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, nor the Son, but the Father alone. For the coming of the Son of Man will be just like the days of Noah. For as in those days before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, until the day that Noah entered the ark, and they did not understand until the flood came and took them all away. So will be with the Son of Man. Then there will be 2 men in a field, and one will be taken and one will be left. 2 women will be grinding at the mill, one will be taken and one will be left. The last thing that we need to know about Noah is that Noah is an example of Christ. Noah is an example of Christ. 1 Peter tells us that the flood was a foreshadowing of the very baptism that we do. That the way God brought water onto the earth, He also brings water onto you. And you're saved, it says, by the baptism, but here's what it's saying. It says, not because you washed off the dirt, right? Not because the actual water, but because you put your faith in one who could wash your conscience. That's what 1 Peter tells us. That Noah precedes Christ and explains Christ to us. When we look at Noah, we should think to ourselves, this guy was like Jesus. Well, in what way? Well, Jesus saved humanity. Noah saved humanity. Jesus was a righteous man. The Bible tells us Noah was a righteous man. That Jesus saved all of those who would put their faith in Him. Noah saved all those who listened to Him. Sadly, that was only a standard. Noah is an example to us of Christ. And we're called in a similar way to be an example of Christ. Not to build a boat. Not to do that. But to be an example. It says about the Noah story that because Noah built a boat, he condemned mankind. And that word condemned doesn't mean like he put them to death. It means He convicted them. He showed them the error of their ways. As He's building the boat, when the waters are coming up, they're saying, we should have listened to Noah, right? And in the same way, your life should be such that people say, that person is weird. But when the waters come up, they say, we should listen to that person. We should go to them. They seem to have it together. They have a plan for their salvation. They seem to have a relationship with God. Your life should be so weird that you should also be an example of Christ, right? So that you can tell people, like Paul tells people, follow me as I follow Christ. You can say, follow me as I follow Christ. You can turn around and say to people, look at my life, it's an example. Noah teaches us to do that. Noah's story is a story of great power. I wish we could go through it detail by detail, but we can't. But what we can know about Noah is that he gave us an example that fits to the T what it means to live now. What it means to live in this time. Because I told you about divorce, right? In the 60s, it was weird, just a few people did it. In the 80s, a lot of people did it, and now it's normal. And I can tell you that story about a million things. I can tell you that story about pornography. I can tell you that story about homosexuality. I can tell you that story about gossip. I can tell you that story about the language we use. That in the 60s, maybe some people did it. In the 80s, a lot of people did it. And now, if you say that it's bad, you're a bad person. That story fits our country to a T. And not just our country, it's all over the world. We live in a time when people don't respect God or the things of God. It's more fun to say, there is no God. The Bible tells us about the future of one who says in his heart, there is no God, right? That's not where you want to be. So how do you live in a time where you acknowledge God? Well, you live like Noah. You live weird. You live different. You look at what everybody's doing and you say, is that what blesses God? For me and my house, we will serve the Lord. Live that way. As I sum up Noah's life, I have this as my kind of parting thought. Romans 12, 1 and 2 says this, therefore I urge you, brethren, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as a living and holy sacrifice acceptable to God, which is your spiritual service of worship. And do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, so that you may prove what the will of God is, that which is good and acceptable and perfect. Noah lived a rough life. Noah saw things that nobody should see. Noah experienced things that nobody should experience, and he had some positive and some negative reactions to that. But his story is told by God. He was a man of faith who refused to be conformed to the world. And as such, he's an example for us as we live in a hostile world. That's what I want you to remember about Noah. I'm going to pray and then we're going to be done. God, thank you for bringing us here and giving us a chance to talk about you. God, I pray that as we